So we'll start here with the Stephen Breyer having announced his retirement from the Supreme Court. And I have a few different angles I want to get into, but the first one, it seems like he's kind of being widely framed as a reliable liberal vote. And I just want to be really, really clear, you guys. The culture issues get all the attention on the Supreme Court. And I don't at all mean to minimize the importance of some of those issues, but we don't ever talk about corporate power or unionization issues, worker issues, economic issues, finance issues. We don't talk about these cases that are often brought to the Supreme Court nearly as often as we do the culture issues like abortion, for instance, gun rights, these kinds of things. Okay. So Stephen Breyer is framed as a liberal, largely from the culture side, when in reality he was one of the most reliable votes for big business throughout his tenure on the Supreme Court. This is not unusual. Even those deemed as lefties on the court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is another example, tended to side with corporations much more than those who were actually on the left would like to see. But the first thing I want to dive into before we get into some of that big business stuff with Breyer is actually sort of a condemnation of his influence on the legal system, which I think some people might have thought he was kind of liberal on, and he really just wasn't. So I'm going to show you guys a thread here from Alec Karakatsantis, who does fantastic work. As always, go follow him at Equality Alec. Today you will hear a lot of glowing discussion about Justice Breyer. This is a different story, one about how a fraud by Breyer led to one of the greatest increases in human caging in modern world history. What he did to so many families is important to know. In the 1980s, Justice Breyer was a main architect of the federal sentencing guidelines, one of the great scandals of mass human caging. But even in legal circles, many people don't understand what Breyer and his co-conspirators did. There were two main and many more frauds perpetrated by bureaucrats who designed the sentencing guidelines. Hundreds of thousands of poor people and people of color were co-signed to millions of extra years in cages as a result of choices Breyer and his group made. First, the guidelines purported to be scientific. Elites said they needed to combat variation among judges, so Breyer and his friends did a past practice study. But after standardizing sentences based on past results as promised, Breyer increased them all. Second, when calculating the average past sentence, again, standardizing was supposed to be the point, Breyer and his friends excluded all the sentences to 0 jail time. That means they artificially cooked the book so that the average sentence would look much higher. In the 18 years the sentencing guidelines were mandatory in federal courts, sentences got longer and longer, and the federal prison population exploded almost 400% from 49,378 to 187,394. Many families were separated and a lot of people died. One of the most vital facts to know about our society is that every additional year in prison takes 2 years off a person's life, and it all adds up. Overall average U.S. life expectancy is 1.8 years lower than if U.S. caged people like comparable countries. This means that this kind of fraudulent pushing of mass, did I get that right? Yeah, fraudulent pushing of mass incarceration actually takes hundreds of millions of life years away from all of us combined. Breyer's sentencing guidelines have controlled federal sentencing for decades, even though they are only advisory now. Everyone was told it was based on evidence, that it was a reform needed to reduce things like racial disparities among judges. That was a lie. Like many elite reforms, it was actually an excuse to expand the punishment bureaucracy, which in the years that followed came to cage Black people at 6 times the rate of South Africa, at the height of apartheid, and greater than any country in modern recorded world history. I write more about how punishment bureaucrats use reform to expand state violence for profit in this article with hundreds of examples. Again, just want to encourage everybody to follow Alec. He's always on top of these legal issues, and how our approach to crime does not work at all and entirely neglects to address the root causes of crime. It just responds to it and fails even at that. Great work from Alec, and I want to make sure everybody understands that there are certain consensuses among the legal community, regardless of where on the political spectrum you might find yourself. So there are certain, big business doesn't really have to much worry about who's appointed to fill a Supreme Court vacancy, do they? When was the last time someone who actually held them to any form of account was appointed to be a Supreme Court justice? The system just kind of maintains itself, right? So, I just wanted to make sure that side of things was made clear, that Breyer was not even really very left on the culture and social stuff, right? He really was just pretty right wing, with the exception of a couple of hot button topics that get him this label. To move on to the business side as well, this is a clip of David Sirota talking about how Breyer and really the Supreme Court more broadly, how they prop up and support big business so consistently, and how that's no accident, that's a product of the institution and the system sort of maintaining itself. So this is David Sirota on Breaking Points talking about the Supreme Court and Justice Breyer.
This week, Stephen Breyer, Supreme Court Justice, is retiring, allowing Biden and the Senate Democrats to fill his shoes. And you have a piece up at the Daily Poster. Let's go ahead and throw this up on the screen, where you say another Supreme Court corporatist would be a disaster. Now, I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn, because all they've heard from the media is, oh, Breyer's a liberal and he's a consistent, reliable vote on the liberal side of things, that he's been pretty bad where it comes to corporate power. First, lay out his legacy, and then we can talk about the moving forward.
Sure. Over the course of his career, Stephen Breyer has been a fairly reliable vote for the agenda of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the biggest and most powerful corporate lobby group in America. So the Chamber files amicus briefs, which urge the court to rule this way or that way. And that's the best way to know what large corporations in America really want. And over the course of his career, according to the data, he has voted with the Chamber of Commerce a majority of times that the Chamber of Commerce has weighed in on cases. So he has been a reliable vote against stronger antitrust enforcement. He has been a vote against various environmental issues when it comes, for instance, he was against a state mining ban. He voted to help empower energy companies to build pipelines through public lands. So the point being, we could go through the list here, but the point being is that Stephen Breyer, even though he was appointed by Bill Clinton, or maybe perhaps because he was appointed by Bill Clinton, he has been a reliable vote for big business. And the problem is that we live in an era where the Supreme Court has become very extremist. Even in compared to recent courts, the Roberts Court has become very extremist when it comes to siding with big business. That essentially the Roberts Court, and let's remember John Roberts used to represent the Chamber of Commerce as a lawyer, that the Roberts Court has become a reliable, probably one of history's most reliable blockades of policy for big business.
So I'm just really glad that you're focusing on this. Nobody ever seems to understand that the law has immense implications for how big business operates. Can you just describe what it means exactly to side with the chamber in court? Like, what does that look like for people? Sure.
I mean, look, Stephen Breyer didn't support all of the chamber's amicus briefs, but broadly speaking, the Chamber of Commerce is not only putting forward judicial nominee names. I mean, that's one of the things that it has been doing. But these amicus briefs push the court on everything from union rights to federal agencies' regulatory power to the ability of, for instance, the SEC to crack down on Wall Street banks. Breyer, by the way, was a vote for a ruling that essentially limited the SEC's ability to punish corporate criminals. So the point being is that the Chamber of Commerce is in these divisive cases where there are questions about the law. Can the SEC, for instance, seriously punish a Wall Street bank? The Chamber of Commerce is filing detailed amicus briefs to try to essentially influence those rulings to make sure the court comes down on the side of corporate power.
And David, I mean, this is kind of a layup for you, but I want to go ahead and ask it. Why is it that the media doesn't explain this well? I mean, we've all heard a lot, and I don't want to downplay these decisions are important. Obergefell, you know, the right for gay people to get married, the right of women to choose for themselves, Roe versus Wade. These are important things, but we hear a lot about those cases. And most people have never heard anything about these other instances where, you know, their work lives and their economic reality are impacted by what the court does. Why is that, David Sirota?
Well, corporate media is corporate. So corporate media isn't all that interested in telling the story of how the corporate America's most powerful lobby group is winning case after case after case at the high court. So there's it's kind of a baked in bias, I would argue, that corporate media is not interested in this. Now, I would also say that a lot of these cases that deal with corporate power are esoteric. They deal with seemingly small, very detailed issues. There was a ruling, for instance, can pensioners sue their retirement fund if their retirement fund is mismanaging their money? And it deals with very arcane parts of the law. So in some ways, writing about that can seem very detailed, very in the weeds. But again, it is sort of the machine thrumming in the background that the Congress will pass something or an agency will try to do something, and then a few years later, an esoteric case will come to the court. The Chamber of Commerce will put forward an amicus brief, and bam, the agency is limited, the law is gutted or overturned, and that keeps happening over and over and over again. And what you end up with at the end of the day is a legal system that has, in many cases, closed the courthouse doors to plaintiffs who are trying to hold big corporations accountable. You have a legal architecture that is rigged against the American worker, that is rigged against the environment. And by the way, one last thing on Stephen Breyer. Back in 2010, months after the Citizens United decision, I mean, he had the nerve to go out and say that the Roberts Court is not actually pro-business, which is so ridiculous. And I think we've seen these justices go out lately trying to defend the legitimacy of the court, because I think they sense that more and more people have caught on to how rigged this court is. But the problem is that in a Supreme Court nomination fight, my guess is we're not going to hear very much about economic issues, even though that is mostly what the court is doing on a day-to-day basis. That we're going to hear a lot about these, definitely, I agree with you, important hot-button social issues, but we will not hear near almost anything when it comes to what the court is doing on a day-to-day basis for big business.
Fantastic as always from David Sirota, and he is exactly spot on that the system is essentially rigged to only bring people to power who are already sort of already tend to just sort of genuflect at the altar of power, like people who you don't really have to convince them. That's already their ideology, right? So it's like a selector mechanism that this system has in place to ensure that nobody rises to power who's going to oppose the system. So it's self-sustaining. Big business's strangle on this court is ridiculous. He mentioned there that Roberts was actually a lawyer for the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, his connections to big business are difficult to ignore. And I think the court is losing some air of legitimacy. I think people are recognizing like that, when it comes to these cases, you guys, it's often that there's multiple legal precedents that run up against each other, and the judges or justices have to basically prioritize. So it really, a lot of what the law is it comes down to just like, sophistry. Like it's lawyers that are really good at finding a way to twist a precedent or twist a law such that it supports their angle in a case, right? It's really not like the idea of formalism is largely nonsense. It's the justices, the law changes as you continue to engage in it, right? So that big business has this stranglehold on the Supreme Court is really problematic, and that these issues get no attention because, as David mentioned there, a lot of them are like really esoteric and wonky and in the weeds, and just they're not the conflict lines that the media can exploit for viewership. So those issues of corporate power and issues of workers' rights and things like this tend to not get much attention. Issues of finance or property, these kinds of things, they tend to be so sort of wonky and dry and almost boring that the media doesn't latch onto them because they can't exploit them. Whereas they can exploit like abortions, they can exploit guns. There are certain cultural hot topic issues that they very much recognize they can exploit, right? So Breyer was certainly no lefty, especially on the corporate issues. And as we mentioned earlier, on the sentencing guidelines and things like that as well. I would not be surprised if he's replaced by another sort of centrist type. There are a couple names that have been floated. Joe Biden did promise to appoint a black woman when he was on the campaign trail. The names I've heard there. Is it Kruger or something along those lines, who is unfortunately quite a centrist. Apparently, she has not sided with labor very often. And there was another name, I want to say Jackson. I might have that one wrong. I've read a number of lists, and those two seem to be on almost all of them. And she apparently actually is somewhat progressive, had struck down a Trump era policy that infringed upon labor organizers' rights and things like that. So hopefully we get the more progressive of the two, but I'm here to warn you guys that there's really no scenario where anyone who's truly left on corporate power issues or labor issues gets appointed to the Supreme Court. So I also want to note that Republicans have been incredibly effective at simply stopping Democrats from even appointing justices to the Supreme Court. If you doubt me on that, just look back over the last handful of years of history. Republicans have been incredibly successful at stopping the Democrats and then forcing through their justices in similar circumstances. And I wouldn't be surprised if this process got, at the very least, drug out quite a ways. I also wouldn't be surprised. The rumors are that Manchin and Sinema will go along with whoever Biden nominates. I wouldn't be surprised if they don't leverage that as well to get more handouts to their corporate donors and things of this nature. They seem to leverage almost every opportunity to do so, and I would not be surprised if they didn't make some noise to try to gain some favors in return for their vote on this. So we'll see how the process goes. We'll see who ends up being nominated by the Biden administration. They did say they wanted to get a nominee through quickly, but I just really doubt that, you guys. The Republicans are very good at obstructing, and the Democrats are almost never inclined to play hardball back or force anything through. So we'll see how that goes. Stephen Breyer, though, is certainly no progressive. The legacy of this Roberts Court and the Supreme Court in general, certainly lately, is incredibly pro-corporate, and I think that will unfortunately continue pretty much regardless of who Biden appoints. Breyer, however, does do the thing that RBG would not, and that is to retire and not assume that Democrats will win again. Of course, this time it might be a little easier to assume Democrats are going to lose, might it, if you take a look at the polls lately, right? And I also wanted to show you guys here just one more little piece. This is kind of about what David was talking about. This is actually in the Daily Poster, which is his outlet. Goes into some of those details about the Chamber's court. 16 years ago, the Chamber launched its campaign to own the Supreme Court with a bang. It got its own former lawyer, John Roberts, a seat on the panel during confirmation hearings that predictably focused on social issues and largely ignored the nominee's record as the go-to lawyer for the business community. And I just want to note, you guys, Roberts, at the time, he was acknowledged to be a pretty stringent conservative, but in years since, he's kind of been deemed almost more of like one of the moderate conservatives on the court compared to the Gorsuches and such. So that I think is a complete misnomer, because that's only looking at the social issues where he's been a little bit less strident in his opposition to the left. When it comes to corporate issues, he's as sure of a vote for the commerce as there is. He and Gorsuch really is probably about as pro-corporate a justice as there is on the court, but Roberts is right there too. So, and that's been the legacy of his court. They're going to get into some of the numbers here. Since then, the Chamber and conservative dark money groups have placed several Roberts clones on the court, and the putatively liberal minority has routinely acquiesced to the Chamber's demands. Save for an occasional anomaly, the Roberts Court has typically delivered rulings that favor capital over labor, retirees, and environment, and any other priority seen as an obstacle to private profit. Data from the Constitutional Accountability Center tell the story of a seismic transformation in American jurisprudence. Whereas Chief Justice Warren Burger's court sided with Chamber amicus briefs just 43% of the time, the Roberts Court has sided with the Chamber 70% of the time, including 83% of the time in the most recent session. In other words, over the course of 2 generations, the High Court went from roughly split on decisions about capital and labor to firmly on the side of capital. Importantly, this transformation happened with the help of Breyer, a Clinton appointee billed as a liberal holdout, even though he often is a conservative accomplice. Again, CIC data tells that story. Breyer has voted with the Chamber position a majority of the time. So I just wanted to dispel any misnomers that Breyer is some sort of liberal or progressive even, or anything of the sort. And really the court in general tends to just side with corporate power. I hope that I'm wrong about my assumption that will not change, but my assumption is that will not change. We'll see what happens, and we'll keep following that story going forward.